Hello everyone, welcome to our first lesson for the third quarter for the school year 2021-2022, which is on fungal diversity. So we basically have two major topics for this quarter. No, after fungal diversity comes animal diversity. So um, fungal diversity, we'll talk about the general classification, the the major features, the salient features of these organisms, and of course their importance. And then we are going to wrap up this lesson with the impact of anthropogenic factors or human activities to fungal diversity. So fungi, if you try to Google the pronunciation, those two are actually acceptable, no? Fungi or fungi, but I'm more accustomed to uh, saying it's a fungi. Okay, and fungi are found everywhere on Earth, and both in terrestrial and aquatic environments, And fungi, uh, very profound yung influence niya not only on the ecological sense kasi nga most of these are known as decomposers, as what you can see in the picture, no, like this vegetative portion of the fungi is trying to decompose, no, yung sa substrate niya, but meron din siyang gamit sa human health. And although they are often thought to be closely related to plants, looking at molecular evidences married with fossil evidences suggest that these organisms are more closely related to animals than they are to plants. So hindi lang sila diverse and widespread, but they are essential for the well-being of most ecosystems. So on top of that, alam natin that fungi break down organic material, and by breaking down these organic material, they recycle nutrients and they allow organisms to assimilate these essential chemicals. And in terms of human use, many fungi are used by human for food source. Like yung truffles na alam natin, yung morels, di ba? Yung ginagamit natin na condiments, di ba? Yung tengang daga, all of these are fungi. So as a food source and applications also in agriculture and forestry. Okay? So for this topic, we will appreciate, no, the importance niya, like yung mycorrhizal associations, with plants, for example. And even yung pag-produce ng first antibiotics, no, yung penicillin was first isolated from a fungi. Okay? But we can't also deny the fact that some fungi uh, are tawag dyan, pathogenic, no, or they cause disease both in plants and animals. So in this lesson, we will investigate yung structure as well as yung evolutionary history of fungi, and then be able to survey yung major groups ng fungi natin, and more importantly, discuss their ecological and commercial significance to wrap up our lesson. Okay? So for today, we should be able to assess muna yung general characteristics. So what are the salient features of fungi? Categorize yung different types of fungi, mainly based on their morphology and their physiological differences, and evaluate their ecological and economic impact. And by the end of the lesson, describe how human activities or yung tinatawag natin na anthropogenic factors contribute to the transmission of fungal pathogens that affect their diversity. Okay? So as an introduction, we might think of fungi as tawag dyan, yung siguro yung very common sa atin, like if we keep our food, if we do not store our food properly, say for example, in the case of bread, no, nagkakaroon siya ng mold over time. And for example, yung rice natin, pag hindi natin siya ni-refrigerate, or if we keep it moist, say for example, di ba, if we keep the lid on, at some point, nagkakaroon siya ng molds. And it might be consensus when I say that once na nagkaroon na ng molds, for example, yung lutuan natin, after some time na ginagamit mo siya, mas madali at mas mabilis na nagkakaroon ng episodes of mold growth, no, growth of mold in these kitchenwares, despite the fact na kahit gaano na nilinis mo siya ng maayos. So bakit kaya? Okay? Now, fungi, in a nutshell, these organisms would secrete enzymes, no? And when they secrete the enzymes, what they do is that they digest these nutrients, no, from complex to simpler nutrients in a way that can be rapidly distributed throughout the organism. So using this mechanism, it allows the rapid growth and adaptation of a wide range of ecological niche. That's why you can see fungi both in the aquatic and the terrestrial environment. And it's also because of fungi, no? We owe it to fungi uh, that plants are able to colonize land, because later on we will learn about this close association between fungi and plants, especially those with a rootless system, no, which helps the plant in the uptake of nutrients and water. Okay? So hindi natin makakaila that some of them would cause disease. For example, yung dito sa mais, nakikita niya yung parang gray coloration dito, and then dito sa bread molds, but some play critical roles in the carbon cycle, breaking down of dead and dying plant matter to rapidly mobilize plant fixed carbon into forms, in a form na pwedeng gamitin ng other organisms. Now, some interesting fungi also, like for example, this one, yung filament like na structure na to that we call hyphae, ginagamit siya to capture organism, something that's really unique to this species of fungi. And there's even a fungi that will try to hijack yung insect natin, na yung tinatawag natin na zombie ants. So when this fungi infects this particular organism right here, what it does is it hijacks the neural tawag dyan, cavity of the brain of this insect, and then it can tawag dyan, it can maneuver kumbaga the whole organism. Okay? Kaya tinatawag siya na zombie ant. So something that's really interesting. And another interesting feature of fungi is that it's actually the classification that contains the largest organism on Earth. Counterintuitively, we might think of vertebrates, like for example, elephant or like blue whale, di ba? As the largest, no? And the reason for this, it's large because we also take into account on what's deep down below. Diba? So hindi lang siya na it's just a stem and a cap that we see on the surface. This portion right here is just a small part of the underground network of these filaments or tendrils that we call mycelium, which can be accounted for the totality of the organism. So if you try to look at it on the surface, malaki siya. It's even twice or three times the size of an average size human. But if it look at these underground networks of mycelium, it's actually way bigger. So that's why it's considered as the largest organism on Earth. No, this goes by the scientific name of Armillaria ostoyae. Okay, Armillaria ostoyae, more commonly known as the honey mushroom. Okay, it's bigger than any plants or animals that you can see on both on water and on land. Okay, so some general features just to wrap things up, no? All fungi are eukaryotic. Ibig sabihin, they have these membrane bound organelles, and their nucleus is also membrane bound, and they are all heterotrophic. So although they look like plants kasi they are sedentary, and then they are just sessile, no? They are on a substrate, para silang root-like structure, but they can't make their own food, di ba? As we have mentioned earlier, they need to digest what's on their substrate from complex to simpler form of nutrients, and then be able to sequester these simpler nutrients and distribute it to the rest of the organism. So in that way, they are heterotrophic. And their cell wall is made up of chitin. So if you try to recall slime molds, diba molds, dapat they should be part of fungi. But because the cell wall of slime molds are made up of cellulose and not of chitin, so hindi siya considered fungi. No? And some fungi can be unicellular as in the case of yeast, no? And multicellular as in the case of molds. No? So they are really very diverse, though, and that makes them distinct from other kingdoms of life. And they all have these filamentous or yung tendrils na sinasabi natin that we call hyphae, and they do not have true tissue. So wala silang specialized tissue that will function for this particular metabolic function or for this another function, parang ganun. They just they work in synergy, across the whole organism. Okay? And alam natin that yung main way that organisms, that fungi would harness nutrients from its environment is via saprotrophic type of nutrition, no? So like animals, most fungi or like all fungi are heterotrophic. They cannot make their own food, no? Something na pwedeng gawin ni plants and algae. But unlike animals, yung fungi, hindi nila kinakain readily yung kanilang food. What they do, they absorb the nutrients from the environment outside of its body. This is done chiefly by secreting these hydrolytic or yung ating digestive enzymes to break down these complex molecules in a way that can be easily absorbed by fungi. So in a way, most fungi are mostly saprobes or saprophytes. So when we say saprophytes, these organisms derive their nutrients from decaying organic matter. So say, for example, in the picture you have in here, a birch polypore that's latching on the surface of a wood. No? And these versatile enzymes enable fungi to digest a wide range of food sources. Hindi lang ito yung rason for their ecological success. Hindi lang ito yung rason that they can be found both in terrestrial and aquatic environments. Another important factor is how their body structure increases the efficiency of their nutrient absorption. So in terms of body structure, meron tayong dalawang types, fungi can be single-celled or multicellular. So example natin kanina yung yeast, sa Saccharomyces cerevisiae, usually ginagamit natin sa baking, para mag-rise yung dough after some time. Okay? Unicellular fungi often grow and thrive in moist environments, And when there is abundant supply of these soluble nutrients, such as sugars and amino acids, it can reproduce by the process of budding. So yung nasa picture na yan, yung one single cell and then may one small protrusion right there, which can later on develop to a mature organism. That's via the process of budding. Multicellular fungi naman, enhance yung kanilang ability to absorb nutrients because of these tendril-like structures, because of these filament-like structures we call hyphae, which is basically a network of these tiny filaments. Okay? And hyphae would consist of these chitinous tubular cell walls that would enclose the cell membrane and cytoplasm of the cells. And chitin, as opposed to cellulose na nakikita natin sa plants and sa slime molds, it strengthens the cell wall and it enhances the absorption of nutrients from the surrounding. Like if you try to compare chitin and cell wall, relatively mas rigid na structural support yung binibigay ni chitin with that of cellulose. And this explains why, for example, yung ating club fungi, if you try to poke it, di ba mura siya gummy, di ba mura siya mag-bounce when stimulus is applied. That's because of these chitin-rich walls, not only providing a strong, flexible polysaccharide support, but it also enhances feeding by absorption. So what it does is, as the fungus would absorb nutrients from the environment, yung concentration of nutrients in the cell increase. This includes nutrients from the surrounding as well as water. So if hindi strong yung structure hindi rigid yung structure ng cell wall ng fungi, what happens is, upon the movement of water and nutrients into the fungal cell wall, nagkakaroon ng increase in pressure, right? So if hindi kayang makontain ng cell wall yung pressure na to, what would happen to fungal cell? It would burst open. So thanks to this chitin-rich cell wall, no, it prevents this pressure from building up, or it contains rather this pressure from building up because of its rigid structure compared to that of a cellulose found in plants. Okay? Now, hyphae, yung ating filament-like features, it comes in two forms. It can be septate or aseptate. Madali lang siyang um, maalala kasi kapag septate, it's composed of compartments. So it's divided by compartments. Ano? Yung ating cross walls that will divide a hypha into cells. A septate naman, it's just a continuous structure of filament ano, na wala siyang compartmentalization. Okay? So in other textbooks, you can see a septate hyphae as sinusitic. Okay? Septate hyphae are characterized by the presence of these cross walls that divide hypha into cells. Yung septa naman natin of hypha can have several functions. So in between these cross walls, pwede siyang merong pores that allows the flow of nutrients throughout the entire mycelium. Okay? And in return, this would increase stability. And if meron siyang, if septated yung ating hypha, what happens is it prevents damage. No? It preserves the rest of the hypha when one of its cells is injured. So halimbawa, yung if you follow my pointer, kung nagkaroon ng damage dito, what will happen is that pwede nyo lang itong i-break off and then the rest will just continue growing. Diba? As compared with that of a septate or sinusitic hyphae. Okay? So, yung septate naman na hyphae, they have pores that are large enough to allow even ribosomes, mitochondria, and even nuclei to flow from cell to cell, especially during reproduction. Ano? So, ganun kalaki yung pores ng ating septate hyphae. Okay? And sinusitic hyphae naman, because it does not have these cross walls, continuous lang yung cytoplasm natin throughout the rest of the hyphae. And in terms of tawag dyan, delivery of nutrients, of course, mas mabilis yung delivery ng nutrients across the hypha doon sa walang compartmentalization. Pero ano nga yung downside nito? What is the possible drawback of a septate or sinusitic hyphae? It will be very much prone to damage. Diba? To physical aberrations. So kapag nagkaroon halimbawa ng damage dito, it will not be able to protect the rest of the hyphae from damage. So most likely, the rest of the hyphae will die off kapag nagkaroon ng damage at one portion of it. Okay? Kapag aseptate siya or sinusitic. Okay? Another interesting structure is this interwoven mass of hyphae that we call a mycelium. So yung kanina, yung filament natin or yung tendril-like structure natin, yung tawag natin sa kanila ay hypha. Hyphae kapag singular. Ang mycelium naman, this is basically a collection, an interwoven mass of these hyphae. Okay? And mycelium would typically infiltrate the food source, making it a very efficient feeding mechanism by increasing the surface to volume ratio. So para ito yung siyang parang roots, in lieu of the roots of plants, merong mycelium yung ating fungi, which is basically a collection of these hyphae. And some fungi would have these specialized branching hyphae such as arbuscules that are used to exchange nutrients between fungi and their plant host. So this occurs in mutually beneficial relationships known as mycorrhizae between the fungi and plant roots. So there are many empirical data that supports the claim na yung mga plants daw that have established mycorrhizal associations with plants tend to grow faster and mas efficient yung kanilang nutrient absorption as opposed to those plants na walang mycorrhizal associations. Okay? So another function of hyphae it allows the movement of or the growth of fungi into new territories. So take note, they are mostly non-motile. No, they cannot run, they cannot swim, they cannot fly. They do not have these appendages like that of animals. So as they grow, this fungi can move into new territory by dispersing, no, via the process of germination. See, later on, meron a part of our discussion will be on how these organisms reproduce, no, both via asexual and asexual reproduction. So yung kanina, for example, sa yeast, an example would be yung ating budding. Ano? Pwede din siya yung fragmentation. Fragmentation is, for example, kapag naputol yung isang part ng hyphae, say for example, it can grow into another or to a new organism. Okay? So we have been talking about these mycorrhizae, no? And mycorrhizae can improve the delivery of these nutrients, no? Phosphate ions, nutrient ions, and other minerals that are essential for plant growth because these vast mycelial networks are more efficient than the plant's roots at acquiring these minerals from the soil. Okay, so what it does is it confers symbiotic relationship. Ano? So yung mycorrhizae, no, yung mycorrhizal na fungi gives nutrients to the plants, and in return, yung plants would supply carbohydrates, no? Kasi carbohydrates is are byproduct of photosynthesis which are necessary for the growth of this fungi. So mycorrhizal fungi, meron tayong two main types depending on their tawag dyan, on their kung saan sila naka-attach sa root system. So if they are only on the surface, if they typically grow on the surface, no, and in the extracellular space of the root cortex, yung sa tip ng ating roots, they are referred to as ectomycorrhizal fungi. Okay? In other textbooks, you can have arbuscular or endomycorrhizal fungi, and contrary or like as opposed to ectomycorrhizal fungi, arbuscular fungi would extend these arbuscules, no, and yung allow me to go back to the previous slide. No? Ito yung arbuscules. They can penetrate in the root system of the plants, no, and as well as in the tubes via the process of invagination. So yung process ng pag-insert ng arbuscules sa root systems ng plants, no, sa root cell walls is via the process of invagination, no, or basically the penetration of these arbuscules to the root cell's plasma membrane. Okay? And meron ding iba't ibang specialized hyphae. So early on, we talked about yung hyphae na adapted for killing or trapping prey, no? So this is actually a soil fungus, and you can see right here in my pointer, no, may portion ng hyphae that is tawag dyan, para siya nag-create ng hoop, no, that tries to constrict, no, around this nematode, this roundworm right here, no, and this growing hyphae then penetrates the worm's body and would digest its prey's inner tissue, and once na-digest niya, saka niya i-absorb. So something that's very typical of fungi. So yung talagang unique lang talaga dito na fungi, no, it's a soil fungus. I forgot the genus, is that it can capture its prey, no. Another interesting, no, hyphae would be these arbuscules, no. This is actually Haustoria. Okay, this Haustoria, it's not beneficial, no, contrary to arbuscular na fungi. It's actually parasitic. So kuha lang siya ng nutrients and it does not give something in return, no. But most arbuscular tawag dyan, fungi or yung ating endomycorrhizal na fungi are beneficial, no? And in terms of reproduction, sinabi natin kanina that both asexual and sexual reproduction are observed among fungi. Okay, so we start with this arrow right here, and this is basically, try to think of it as a single filament. Say for example, you have a bread mold, okay, and and one filament can interact with another filament, no, and they can fuse their cytoplasm. Yung process na to is via the process of plasmogamy. So when they're fused their cytoplasm, it does not mean na mag-fuse din yung kanilang nuclei right away. So during the process of plasmogamy, it's only the cytoplasm that's joined, but the nuclei are unjoined, no, unfused siya. So pwede siya na one part siya na meron siyang dalawang nuclei. And this can go on for weeks, for months, even for years, no, depending from species to species. Now this one will undergo heterokaryotic stage. Hetero kasi nga unfused yung kanyang nuclei. Okay? But they are just one part, no? Two nuclei from different parent. And when conditions become favorable, that's the time karyogamy takes place. Or yung karyogamy natin, ito yung fusion of two nuclei. So from N, okay, what happens is nagkakaroon na tayo ng diploid diploid na tawag dyan na zygote, no? 2N na siya. And this one right here, when a zygote is formed, it will undergo meiosis. So this meiosis right here from 2N, maging N na lang siya, no? When it becomes spores or yung sporangia natin. Now these spores, when they germinate, no? Take note, spores, if walang external factors like wind or water, it will not be able to germinate. So because of these net external factors, it will now germinate into other places. And when conditions are favorable, it can now grow into a new organism, and then hyphae will form, and many hyphae will come up, will constitute a mycelium. No? Bunch of hyphae is a mycelium. So that's for sexual reproduction. Sexual siya kasi merong fusion, di ba? May fusion of nuclei. But there is also an episode of asexual reproduction among fungi. That happens when some spore-producing structure, say for example, yung mushroom na alam natin, di ba, yung may parang club, yung may vegetative portion, yung parang club na fungi, say for example, sa ilalim nun, there are these finger-like structures that contains these spores, and when these spores are germinated to another location, it can grow to a mature hyphae rather, and then we later on become a bunch of hyphae called mycelium. So in a way, asexual siya because these spores can just grow on its own. Okay? And saan ang galing yung spores? Via the process of sexual reproduction. Okay? So nagets lang, no? Spores can grow on its own to become hyphae. A bunch of hyphae is called a mycelium. Saan ang galing si spores? Via the process of sexual reproduction. That is first by the fusion of cytoplasm, by the process of plasmogamy, and then after plasmogamy, nagkakaroon ka ng heterokaryon, or basically an organism na meron siyang unfused nuclei pero isang organism siya. Okay? And when conditions become favorable, the nuclei would fuse, forming into a zygote, and then meiosis will give way for spore formation. So ganun lang yung sa ating fungi. So very much similar siya sa na-discuss natin in protease, no? And it makes sense, no, kasi nga slime molds are the closest relatives of these organisms. Okay? Yung ating yung evolutionary relationship of fungi actually tells us that its common ancestor was a flagellated saprotroph, no? Na meron siyang chitin in the cell wall. Okay? So for our next discussion on the major classifications, we are going to touch about the major classifications of these organisms. And then we are going to annotate ano yung mga salient features of each classification. Okay? So thank you everyone for listening. I hope this video recording will help you in your preparations, in your study in general. Okay? So God bless everyone. Bye-bye.